From Informa Tech Target, I'm David Essex, and this is Enterprise Apps Unpacked. I mentioned in the podcast on how EY is training employees to use AI that I find it especially informative to talk to people from the Big Four accounting firms. They have a lot of experience deploying enterprise apps and emerging technology internally and sharing what they learn with clients. Deloitte, another member of the Big Four, recently published an article on its website called Harnessing Internal Controls to Mitigate Risk and Enhance Value in Cloud-Based ERP Finance Transformations. I know, it sounds like one of those academic papers with a real snoozer for a title, but it calls much-needed attention to a process that companies should have in place before they move such a critical function to the cloud. The article makes a strong case, then lays out the general steps for establishing controls. It's not surprising, given Deloitte's history in accounting and auditing, that it would be so adamant in advising caution, planning, and preparation to address the financial, operational, and compliance risks of moving finance operations to the cloud. The accounting and financial management modules of ERP systems are often the first ones companies move to the cloud, especially if they have older on-premises ERP with other modules that are harder to move. An example of this is when SAP customers, who are under some pressure to adopt SAP's new ERP platform S/4HANA, start with the S/4HANA Finance module, often running it in a private cloud to maintain some control as a halfway measure before moving to a shared public cloud. The ultimate destination might be multi-tenant software as a service, with all its advantages in cost, ease of use, scalability, accessibility, and integration. SaaS ERP also tends to have generic features that, on the one hand, are said to enforce best practices. On the other hand, they can force companies to choose which customizations in their legacy ERP are worth trying to replicate in SaaS, maybe by configuring the cloud software or writing extensions for it. They often have to jettison old, familiar features and adopt a new way of doing business. And they usually have to clean up their data before moving it to the cloud. It's a lot of change that can break things and add complications that put the security and accuracy of a company's financial process at risk. Today's guests are the article's co-authors. Laura Bellinger is a partner in Deloitte's audit and assurance practice, and David Rains is a principal in the practice who leads the digital controls for ERP and cloud offering. We talked about the kinds of controls you need, who's responsible for developing and enforcing them, where the controls live, is it in policies or software or some combination, and how AI can help. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to Enterprise Apps Unpacked for the real story on the software that runs your business. Laura and David, I want to thank you very much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you, David. Excited to be here. Really enjoy your podcast. So thank you for having us.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Deloitte recently published a point of view article written by the two of you about the importance of establishing an internal controls environment when adopting cloud ERP. I was wondering, why does Deloitte feel it's important to get that message out now?
Sure, David. So ERP systems are really at the heart or the core of how companies operate today. And as organizations move to the cloud, they're facing new risks, new challenges around data, around compliance, as well as oversight as companies continue to develop their cloud strategy. So we want leaders to see that internal controls are not simply about checking the boxes. They build confidence in the system. They protect information, and they also can help organizations grow safely from a risk management standpoint. So establishing internal controls from the start is important because it helps manage risk and really drives strong oversight during the transformation program, as well as establishing the baseline of controls and setting the tone going forward. So really an effective and smart way to do this is to embed the go forward controls at day one of go live to allow for support of compliance activities, to support operational efficiency, and stronger business outcomes as the new systems and processes launch. So we're certainly working to get the message out. That's important to consider designing of internal controls as early as blueprinting or phase zero in a finance transformation program that includes cloud ERP.
Mhm. So, do you have any statistics or at least some anecdotal evidence about what percentage of organizations that should have these internal controls for ERP actually do?
Yes, David. What I can tell you anecdotally is that most organizations are really still relying on and using outdated or incomplete controls. And that perspective is really based on the evolving uh, pace of change with respect to how technology is being deployed in organizations today, and especially as we think about that shift to cloud ERP. Uh, and one thing that we really want to highlight, and this hopefully comes through our point of view, is that moving to the cloud really gives organizations the chance to modernize, the chance to improve their control environment. And so taking time to, as David just mentioned, pause and think about that control environment from phase zero, from the design of an ERP transformation project, is really going to give the opportunity to help think through risk, manage and mitigate that risk from the onset, and really help think about those compliance needs and control deployment to get greater value out of the technology transformation.
The article places this specifically in the context of moving to cloud ERP. And I think it mentioned even especially for financial, and accounting purposes. And presumably this is a move from an on-premises ERP or some hybrid maybe of on-premises and cloud. Is there something about migrating to cloud ERP that makes it especially important to have internal controls, maybe because of the ways the cloud differs from on-premises? Which, as we know, tends to be more monolithic in an all-in-one system, and that, maybe has one or two cloud systems attached. And then, some people make the move ultimately to, an almost entirely cloud-based or SaaS-based CRP. I'm just wondering if there's something about that particular process that makes these controls so necessary.
Yeah. Migrating to cloud ERP is different from on-prem ERP because it introduces a shared responsibility model for internal controls. So with traditional on-prem, organizations typically manage all the controls themselves or perhaps have contractors employed by the organization. But that overall oversight for maintaining the end-to-end view of the internal controls exists. In a cloud ERP environment, some controls are handled by the cloud provider, while others remain the responsibility of the organization. An example could be aspects of access security or certain aspects of program change control. So the shift makes it really important to clearly define responsibility for operation of the internal controls on day one, as well as being clear that the responsibilities and roles are established during the implementation process. And the intent is to manage risks, to prevent gaps that could arise from unclear ownership. And what we do is we look at COSO Principle 9 in these instances that states the entity identifies and assesses changes that could impact the system of internal control. And we look at that in terms of driving management's action around the responsibility that they assume in these finance transformations. And what does not need to happen is just assuming the third party or the vendor has the control requirements addressed or outperforming them. So the need for strong go forward controls is greater in the cloud context due to these new boundaries and the evolving nature of cloud services.
I'm wondering where the internal controls actually live, so to speak. How much of these exist in maybe corporate policies, and how much of it is digitized or partially automated in software?
I love this question, David. So thank you so much for asking. Because as a risk and controls person, I think it's really important to point out that internal controls can really live within every corner of an organization. To your point, this includes things like corporate policy, where expectations of an organization and how its processes are operated are really defined and written down, all the way to being facilitated by, enabled by automated software. And so I think it's important that organizations are thinking about the fact that automated software can really help your organization comply with your own policies and procedures. For example, you probably have a policy and procedure at most organizations related to who has logical access to different functions in an application or an ERP. And the system should really be designed, configured to enforce, what those rules are that are going to allow, users to perform those activities that they need access to perform, and potentially prevent them from doing things that might, circumvent the company's expectations. I think in this case, automation can also really help monitor different types of activities and flag potential issues, which should be following a company's or governance expectations to help keep accountability really clear. So those things together really form what I think about as a living control environment to support appropriate security and, of course, consistency throughout the business and processing of transactions.
Well, you kind of, I think you partially answered this already, Laura, but what kind of software, if it's automated or somehow encoded, in the policies in software. Is it like enterprise risk management, or is it just in the ERP? Is it in financials, something like that?
Yeah, we really see this in a variety of different software use cases. So certainly inclusive of the ERP native capabilities, like we're spending a lot of time talking about today. We also see it coming through in vendor or third party applications that may be interfaced to or bolted on to the ERP. If you think about a transaction originating outside of an ERP and needing to sort of integrate its way into the transaction, we end up seeing, it being an important consideration to step back and think about how internal controls may influence the complete, let's say, IT landscape with respect to supporting the organization's overall control environment. And I would reinforce some of what David Rains had mentioned earlier with respect to thinking about control design and risk mitigation, really through the onset and at every stage of a technology transformation. Generally ERP implementations are not going to be just that, one ERP technology. There might be other pieces of middleware or APIs or other automation sources. And so, really stepping back to think about risk mitigation and control design during design and test and deployment of each of those different pieces of software. And then, of course, once we get to that day one go live moment and thinking about, the controls considerations through ongoing maintenance of the new system. Um, because the controls are really so central to the system's development, they really become foundational to its ongoing operation.
The point of view article says there's a role here for AI. How can AI help with these internal controls?
Sure, David. Yeah. As we're seeing in many aspects of business and really daily life in general, AI can help make us get things done smarter, faster, and more consistent. And that's certainly no different in an internal controls environment. It can be used to scan large volumes of data and spot unusual patterns. It can handle routine tasks like reconciliations or access reviews, ultimately just allowing more time for employees to focus on higher value work. Over time, I would say that AI supports a control environment that's always improving, and changing. And this is across the control life cycle. So things from a controls implementation, starting with risk assessment, identification of controls, controls rationalization, as well as the day-to-day execution and monitoring. However, it's important to remember that while AI can support and enhance human ability and decision making, it still requires oversight. So, strong governance is important for AI enabled controls, and organizations need policies. They need to identify clear roles and escalation paths that promote accountability. In addition to accountability, also promoting transparency and compliance whenever AI is used. So, fostering an innovative culture where AI and human ability complement each other is critical, as well as the ongoing oversight, accountability, and continuous engagement, which is essential as well.
Okay. What areas um, should a good set of internal controls address? I think you've mentioned security already, but I imagine there are other kind of big buckets or categories that it should look at.
Sure, I'll chime in here, David, that I think a strong control environment should really be covering controls around financial accuracy. And I say this from my role supporting audit and assurance clients, operational performance, regulatory compliance. There are many areas, but if I hone in on those three, which are really very critical, financial controls really help ensure reliable reporting and reduce the opportunity or chance for misstatements in financial results or fraudulent activity. Operational controls would really be helping make sure that systems are efficient, that data is secure, that processes utilizing those technologies are operating efficiently as well. And from a compliance perspective, making sure that organizations stay connected and achieving their legal compliance requirements as well as industry standards. Those are the ones that I think are really important, especially if you think about, where this consideration of bringing in controls throughout, the design and system development lifecycle would be really important. I think it's also important to talk about the fact that these controls would typically encompass a blend of preventive controls, so, working to mitigate risk and keep that low before it would actually occur, as well as detective and corrective control mechanisms that, really all of those components combined are what really create the framework to help with the integrity of an ERP system. And then, all of these operating together really helps the business itself run more smoothly with greater confidence in that IT landscape.
Now, you've mentioned operational a few times, but the focus does seem to be, yeah, unless I'm misunderstanding it, very much on the financial and accounting pieces of ERP. And I understand why, given all the compliance requirements around that. But why not also some controls for things like order management, maybe customer relationship management, or supply chain management?
Yep, great question, and glad you brought this up. To your point, financial controls are a logical place to start as they support accurate financial reporting, compliance with regulations, and these controls can help leadership as well as stakeholders trust with the numbers they see, which is important to the performance and longevity of the company. Operational controls are a major category of controls closely linked to financial outcomes as well, in addition to quality control, process effectiveness, among others. They also are critical to maintaining the reliability and capturing the value in cloud environment. So certainly operational controls are important to consider as stakeholders evaluate their overall control environment for transformations, and that involves a move to cloud as well. So the points that are called out that we're discussing apply to financial controls as well as operational controls in terms of the design effectiveness and mitigating operational risks for these types of moves to cloud ERP.
Can you outline the main steps of establishing the internal controls? The point of view article says to do it from the very outset when you're identifying requirements, which is actually pretty early in the process. So I'm wondering about that step and the later steps.
Absolutely, David. And I think David Rains alluded to this earlier in our session today. But really, the most important step is starting early. Ideally, controls are included within the implementation plan and not added on later. So this can mean thinking about internal controls as early as that blueprinting or phase 0 portion of your ERP system transformation. And you start this by outlining controls governance and controls objectives, then proactively building those controls throughout the design, development, test, and rollout phases. Once you get to go live, it's then really critical to monitor for continuous improvement. For example, as the pace of business and technology shift really starts to pick up at scale.
Who does all this work? What are the different job roles and management levels that have to be involved in establishing these internal controls?
Yeah. Controls are really a shared responsibility across leadership and the business line functions. We commonly refer to that as the three lines of defense, with the first, second, and third lines of internal control responsibility. The CFO and CIO often lead the effort with support from the CEO and the board, and they set expectations and make sure that the governance that Laura was just speaking to and ethics stay at the forefront. Then the first lines, for instance, maybe a finance team or a technology team will carry out the day-to-day work. They're essentially the control owners and execute these on a daily or periodic basis. Compliance and risk are responsible for owning the corporate policies and internal control frameworks, and that's referred to as the second line. And then for the third line, internal audit evaluates if the controls are designed and operated effectively. So it's not just the job of the compliance team or the auditors. Everyone from executives to controllers and operators have an important part to play throughout the implementation and go forward post day one. It's important to understand that coordination across these three lines is really required to achieve the control objectives, and that those roles need to be clearly defined and responsibilities communicated as well.
And if I could just add on really quickly here, David and David, I want to reiterate that I think the organizations where we have seen this concept of, control design during an ERP transformation has really been most successful when we do see all three of those lines of defense that David just talked through coming to the table together, because it's so important that, the operators of the controls, the users of the system know and understand their role as control owners going forward. And so then thinking about how that layers in with risk mitigation in the second line, and then that compliance function, being able to provide thoughts and recommendations and really think about making sure we've got all of those components addressed. So it does end up being a large investment, but having everybody at the table, I think, is one thing that, I'd really like any listeners to understand and think about if they're, thinking about going down an implementation such as an ERP transformation.
Does Deloitte's advice on this vary by company size? I would imagine that small to medium-sized businesses might have less stringent expectations, but I'm not really sure of that. Because some small businesses can barely afford a new ERP system, whether it's their very first one or, let's say, an upgrade or a new one moving to cloud. So I'm wondering if this is mostly for big companies.
Yeah, I would say that the principles don't really change if you think about having an effectively designed control environment to mitigate risk. But certainly, I think the scaling does change. Some organizations might have much more complex processes than others, depending on size of their operations or their leadership team's perspectives. I do think that what matters most, regardless of size of the organization, is having that appropriate oversight, accountability, and a control framework that fits the company's needs and goals. The right controls should, in theory, make it easier to adapt as an organization grows, for example.
It sounds like a lot of work, and possibly that might cost something that might cost a lot of money if companies have to hire a third party to help them with it. Why is it worth those kinds of resources?
Yeah, it really comes down to managing the risk. So, weak or outdated controls can lead to major financial issues, reputational problems, compliance failures, data breaches, etc. So, investing in strong controls can help minimize those risks. And then controls can also unlock the value and improve operational efficiency, like we talked about earlier, from enabling faster closing of the books to data-driven decision making. So the other factor here is that when using automation, this all can increase efficiency and effectiveness while reducing manual work as well.
What does Deloitte do if a client hires it to help with internal controls for ERP? What are the steps that you help them do?
We work with organizations to assess, advise on, and help design modern internal controls as part of the ERP transformation lifecycle. So, what that really means is stepping back to help organizations to evaluate risk and then recommending governance enhancements and providing insights on how to best leverage automation through their ERP technology, through those, other software applications that may be integrated, and even through AI to help strengthen oversight. We can also help design and implement those effective controls. Our goal here is really to advise clients on how to create a control-ready environment to not only support compliance, but also boost efficiency and become a control environment that's adaptable as the technology and the risks for the organization evolve.
I feel like I'm at the risk of asking you to repeat yourselves here, but what are the benefits of doing this? Maybe besides some of the sort of major ones, like maybe those and sort of ultimate benefits to a company if they have these internal controls for ERP.
Yeah, so like you said, David, a lot of what we would point to here is what Laura just discussed. I would say, additionally, internal data is more reliable. It enables better decision making. So outside of just the compliance aspect, but you also have proactive identification of potential issues and reducing gaps that you may find overall. So it allows team to focus on improving performance instead of fixing issues that arise. I will say that organizations that prioritize strong internal controls can be better positioned just to mitigate risk. And we've alluded to that a few times in our discussion, but enabling you to realize the full potential of the ERP that's now in the cloud. So strong controls create trust among stakeholders and really, I would say, lay the groundwork for future growth.
We usually end the podcast on a positive note, but I guess I am ending on a negative note here. What are the risks of not having internal controls? And maybe some of the big risks, like almost worst case scenario, if you don't have them.
Certainly. I mean, without proper controls, David, companies really open themselves up to a host of issues, risks around, financial, operational, compliance matters. Specifically, if we're thinking about our organizations that are publicly traded, legal risks as well, just with respect to thinking about as David Range just mentioned around data compliance and whatnot. Uh, Any of these issues can lead to reputational damage. And so that can cause lasting harm to a business if not done properly. So thinking about, a strong control environment can really help prevent those types of outcomes to help keep the organization more secure and more reliable over time, which, is really the goal of coming through a technology transformation like an ERP implementation.
Well, you did manage to end on a high note, Laura. So I will thank you both again, Laura and David, for being on the podcast.
Yes, thank you, David.
Thank you for having us, David.
Thank you for listening to Enterprise Apps Unpacked, where we give the real story on the software that runs your business. To learn more about business applications, explore our content on searcherp.com. Find us on YouTube at our channel, Ion Tech. Subscribe to our podcast to receive the latest episodes as they drop. And if you liked what you heard today, give us a rating and review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you're listening. Until next time.
Podcast programming and promotion by Kelsey Waddell. Podcast production and quality oversight by Anne Steshu. Music supplied by DP via Getty Images. This is an Informa Tech Target production.